I desire mercy, not sacrifice. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. My name's Arthur. Thank you for joining me as we meditate in Matthew chapter 12, where Jesus is being confronted by the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the community, the educated people who see themselves as above the ordinary people. They would criticize Jesus for being friends of tax collectors and sinners, those who are not so educated, those who are engaged in a normal life, because these sinners were not particularly bad people. They're just the ordinary people who are not proud of their religious observance. And of course the tax collectors are just public servants doing their job for the Romans, but accused by the Pharisees of betraying Israel and the God of Israel. In chapter 11, Jesus affirmed that he was the Messiah, because John the Baptist sent his disciples saying, "Are you the one who's to come?" And John said, "Look at the evidence. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." These are what the Old Testament said things would be like in the kingdom of heaven. And then he specifically said that John was the fulfillment of the prophecy in Malachi that God would send a messenger before the Messiah. And John had pointed to Jesus. So Jesus is fairly explicitly saying, "Yes, I am the Messiah." But then he complains that the people have not responded. They didn't respond to John the Baptist, particularly the spiritual leaders, the Pharisees, and they were not responding to him. John had lived an austere life. Jesus was engaging with the people. Either way, they found fault. He warned them that had the people of Sodom seen the miracles that Jesus performed in Capernaum, Sodom would have remained to this day. It would not have been judged. It would have repented. But Capernaum, having seen so many mighty works, had not repented. And Jesus had put out the plea, "Come to me, all you who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Those who were heavy laden were those who had been put under heavy bonds by the Pharisees, religious requirements that were very demanding. And Jesus saying, "I'm not going to be so demanding in the requirements that I have. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Because Jesus is not about burdening people. He is about blessing people. Well, chapter 12 brings us head to head with his confrontation with the Pharisees. Verse 1. At that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry, and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." But he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath, and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, 'I desire mercy and not sacrifice,' you would have not condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." And may the Lord bless these words to us. The Pharisees can't find fault with Jesus in terms of the things that he does, except in regard to their own traditions. The Jewish people have a whole host of traditions, which Jesus called the traditions of the elders, which modern Jews called the oral law, and the Pharisees claim that this oral law was given by Moses and passed down alongside of the written law, which we have in our Bible, and that it is equally as binding. Jesus does not accept the oral law. His focus is always on the written law. And so, in this debate, he refers them again to what is written in the law, and in particular, their interpretation of not working on the Sabbath is wrong because they've misunderstood its purpose. Jesus is walking through the fields with his disciples. It's early spring. The harvest is almost ready. The disciples are hungry and they pick a few heads of grain to eat along the way. Now, technically you can say they're harvesting, but the way that Jesus sees it, no, they're eating, and you're allowed to eat on the Sabbath. So the first analogy that he picks up from the Old Testament is when David was hungry and the men with him. And they were permitted to eat bread that normally they would not be permitted to eat, bread that had been on display in the temple for a week and had just been replaced by fresh bread. They could eat it because they were hungry and they were about the Lord's business. So the disciples were hungry. They hadn't had anything to eat that day already. If they'd had other food they would have eaten it, but they didn't, and so they were eating straight from the field. They are not putting it in a sack and taking it home to use tomorrow. That's forbidden by the law. That would be considered work. But no, they are walking along through the fields and taking a few heads of grain and eating them on the spot. So they are not breaking the law. They are not working. They are not harvesting. They're simply eating. But the Pharisees took fault. They're breaking the law. Now, the Pharisees could not find other faults with Jesus, so the main criticism they have with him is in relation to the things that he does on the Sabbath, because it is the Sabbath law which they had most heavily bound the people. They had put a heavy load on the people about all their regulations, and Jesus in Matthew 23 spells that out. But here he is just confronting them in a simple manner. As we've seen, David ate the showbread, which was only for the priests to eat. But the priests gave it to David and to the men who were with him, only requiring that they were not unclean. In the account in Samuel, we're not told specifically about the men who were with him, but evidently there were some men with him. They were not men of stature as David, they were just ordinary folk, and they ate this holy bread as well. The implication here is that Jesus was entitled to do whatever he liked as God on the Sabbath. As he said, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And so the disciples who are with him, by virtue that they are with Jesus, are also entitled to eat because they are hungry. And then you have the fact that the priests are very busy on the Sabbath with their sacrifices and everything else that they do. And God doesn't complain about them. You could say they're working. No, they're doing the ministry that is required of them. Basically, he then concludes, well, there's one greater than the temple, and that's me. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. It's up to God to say what is allowed and what is not allowed. And God is manifest in the flesh as the man Jesus Christ, who referred to himself as the Son of Man, a title of his sovereignty from the book of Daniel. And the principle that operates in terms of working out what to do on the Sabbath is a simple principle. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. The Jews were not to do their regular work, buying and selling, harvesting, sowing, all of those kind of things. They were to have a day off from that, a day when they had time to relax for recreation and for worship of God. But in irregular circumstances, where there is a need to do your regular work, because there is a particular need, then you may. You can do good on the Sabbath. You can show mercy. The whole idea of not working is that you rest because God rested on the seventh day. But as Jesus elsewhere explains, God didn't completely rest. He didn't shut up shop, because then the world would have ceased to function. He needs to maintain the world. On the Sabbath you're allowed to eat. There are lots of things that you can do. The commandment is that you don't go to work. You don't do your regular work. You have a day off from your work. You go and do something else for the day. This is the principle that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So something that is good for man is valid on the Sabbath, and something that hurts man is not valid, indeed any day. So the disciples were allowed to eat, and Jesus was not breaking God's law even though he was breaking their law.